Yosef's rise to power in Egypt is a truly phenomenal story, and yet there's another dimension to that story that we might just miss were it not for the Rebbe's insight into Rashi. What happened, as we very well know, is that there was this terrible famine in Egypt, and the Egyptians came crying to Paroi for bread. And Paroi tells the Egyptians, go to Yosef, whatever he tells you to do, you need to do. Or Pirish Rashi, we're going to have a look at Rashi's interpretation. We're going to split it into two parts. So we'll do the first part initially, and then we'll look at the subsequent part of Rashi. So first Rashi explains the nature of the famine, and then he explains these words that Paroi tells the people, whatever Yosef tells you to do, you need to do. Umefarish. Says Rashi, what does that mean? So we'll first focus on the earlier part of Rashi's interpretation, which is, what did he tell them to do? Because Paroi says, whatever Yosef tells you, you need to do. He told them that they needed to have a bris. And then there's a motivation that Rashi gives, why Paroi said that they have to listen to Yosef. We'll get to that. First, we have some questions. If you read the pasuk simply, the people went crying to Pharaoh for food, and Paroi tells them to go to Yosef. Now, this is not surprising, because Paroi had previously said that you, Yosef, you'll be the one to feed and sustain all the people. You have the power. So, if Paroi tells the people to go to Yosef, that's quite obvious, because he had empowered Yosef to make these decisions about the distribution of food and so on. So it's no surprise. If it's no surprise, why do we have to explain it? Even if you have to say that there's a reason that somehow we need to explain why Paroi was sending them to Yosef. We know that Rashi has a foundational principle of how he explains things, and he repeats this principle multiple times. Rashi is clear that he only focuses on the pshat, the simple explanation of the pasuk, and any medrash that will help us to settle the simple understanding of the pasuk. Where does Rashi see anywhere at face value of the psukim that the people had already been to Yosef? Because what is he interpreting? He says they came to Paro to ask for bread. Paro says go to Yosef. Whatever he tells them to do, you should do, which is what? Have a bris. Well, how did we know that he told them to have a bris? Where does it indicate that anywhere in the pasuk previously? So, it seems that Rashi's interpretation doesn't fit the pshat. The pshat is they went to Paroi. Rashi's inserting they went to Paroi because they had already been to Yosef, and Yosef told them to do something, having a bris, and therefore they went back to Paroi. Where do you get this from? Gam kasha, in fact, the question only gets more complex. Adarab, l'shoina kosef sheparo emleim asher yoimar l'shoin osid lachem tasu v'lo asher omar l'shoin ovar mashma shadayin lo yomer Yosef daber binyan zeh. The fact that Paroi replies to the people and says, whatever Yosef will tell you, you need to listen, that implies that he hadn't yet told them anything. So Rashi's interpretation actually seems to contradict the pshat, the simple understanding of the pasuk. So where does Rashi get this from? Doesn't seem to be clear in the Torah. So some of the commentaries are going to try and offer answers to it, and the Rebbe is not going to accept the explanations. So some of the commentaries say, look, the way that Paroi speaks in this pasuk is he says more than appears to be necessary, and that insinuates that there was a previous conversation between the people and Yosef, and Paroi responds to that conversation. So, let's take it at face value. Let's say that the people came directly to Paroi. Please give us food. Paroi says, it's not my job. I've got a minister of finance, or whatever his position was, the viceroy of Egypt. Go to him, he'll give you food. So then, then the pasuk should have just said, Paroi told the people, go to Yosef. That's it. End of story. But the fact that the Torah tells us that Paroi told them, go to Yosef and do whatever he says, so the Mefarshim say, move on, Shehem Kfar Hayu Eitzel Yosef. Veshu Amalem Davar Shelo Ratzu Lasos. Valzeh Bo Mane Paroi Shehem Lachem Tasu. So that's how the Mefarshim explain it. The fact that he says, go to Yosef and do what he says, that implies that Yosef must have said something to them. They clearly were not happy with his suggestion. And Paroi endorses this and says, you've got to go do whatever it is that he said. So those are the Mefarshim. However, there are two primary reasons why this is not good enough for our understanding of Rashi. Okay, it's difficult to use this explanation. Key. First of all, Dafka. Okay, let's say we go with this particular argument and we say that Paro told the people, I know you've already been given an instruction by Yosef and you don't like it, but go ahead and do it. How do we know that instruction is to have a bris? Where do you see that in the words? But besides that, there are two other issues. The fact that it's Yoimar in the future tense is very clear that he hasn't said anything yet. So we haven't resolved that by explaining that the Arichus Haloshen, that the fact that Paroi specifically said not just go to Yosef but do whatever he says, it's future tense. It hasn't resolved the question of how do you know now that he had told them something before. Second of all, Yosef now, if we are going to go with the Mefarshim, which effectively are telling us that Paroi tells the people that you have to listen to Yosef after he had already made a statewide rule that you have to listen to Yosef, and whatever he says goes, so then then the language style that Rashi would have used would have flowed out of these words, Asher Yomar Lochem Tasu, whatever he tells you, you need to do. And Rashi would have said something along the lines of, Mikan, something along the lines of, now we know that he was saying, Mikan, from here we learn that whatever it is that Yosef would tell them, Paroi endorsed. That's not the wording that Rashi uses. אין העניין הנילמד מטבעס אלו, אלא שדבר הידוע כבר ומובא כאן בתור הקדמה של פירוש, שעל פיה יובן שהטבעס אשר לכם תעשו, פירוש שאומר לכם אלוהים וכו'. The way that Rashi phrases it, Rashi says, because Yosef had told them, that almost makes it sound like, you know what I'm talking about. You know that he's already told them something. It's quite obvious what he wanted from them, and they didn't like it, and our Paroi wanted to endorse it. So let's not explain it that Paroi is saying that out of these extra words, we appreciate that something's going on over here. It's not the way that Rashi frames it. Rashi frames it almost as something which is self-evident. Okay, now before we address that, let's look at the rest of the Rashi, because that's going to have even more issues to query. In the continuation of the same Rashi, he explains that this is what happened in the conversation between Paroi and the nation. When they came in front of Paroi and they said, gee, this is what he's telling us. Why did you not gather your own produce? Why are you relying on Yosef's storehouses? Didn't he tell you that there was going to be a famine? Didn't he predict this? Or maybe even cause it through his prediction? So they said, we did. We gathered and we stored things away and it's all rotted. So Rashi says that Paroi then said to the people, if that's the case, that everything that you have stored for the famine has become rotten, definitely listen to whatever Yosef tells you. Look what happened. He's the one who made a decree that we were going to have a famine. He's the one who made a decree that your produce is going to rot. What happens if the next thing he does is he makes a decree against us and we all die, and the implication is die immediately? So you better listen to him. That's Rashi's continuation of the Pirush, which raises a number of questions. It's quite a difficult Pirush to understand. First of all, number one, Where does Rashi find any evidence of any of this in the words of the pasuk? Rashi is pshat, the simple meaning of the words. Well, where in the simple meaning of the words does it indicate there was any of this kind of a conversation? It just says they cried to Paroi for bread. Base number 2. Once they told Paro that all of their stored grain had rotted, well then obviously he says you've got to go to Yosef and do whatever he says. Obviously you don't have food, you don't have a choice. You're not in a privileged position over here. Whatever he says, he's the person who holds the purse strings. What don't we understand about the story? The people complain, Paroi, we want bread. He says, go to Yosef. Why didn't you store? We did store. It's all gone. Well, then you definitely have to go to Yosef. Who needs this whole protracted conversation about what might happen next? Question number 3. Rashi Mosef al Lashon HaKosov Kol Asher Yomar. The Torah says that Paroi said to the people, Asher Yomar, what he tells you, you should do. Rashi adds, Kol Asher Yomar. Everything he tells you. Why that nuance? Why do we have to say everything? Question number 4. Rashi says that Paro told the people, what if he will decree something against us? In other words, he included himself. He could have easily said, look, he decreed against your grain and it all rotted. What if he decrees against you and you all die? But he doesn't say that. He says, what if he decrees against us? Why is Paro suddenly including himself in this potential decree? Up until this point in time, he seemed to be unscathed. And lastly, hey, Misa man Karashmei, dying, that's a radical suggestion that Yosef might decree that everybody dies. Where do we find that? Who even alluded to that in the Psukim? Now, you might say Rashi has based himself on a medrash, and all of these details are recorded in the medrash, but still. We have already established both in this Sikha earlier and in many other talks of the Rebbe that Rashi doesn't quote a medrash unless it is necessary to settle the simple understanding of the pasuk. And as we've already illustrated, the simple understanding of the pasuk is just that, simple to understand. So why do we need to include the details of this medrash that apparently are unnecessary to help us understand the storyline? The storyline is simple. People are starving, they go to their king. The king says, I'm not in charge, I have a minister of finance, go to him. Simple story. If he tells you to do things, you have no choice. Okay, let's even look from both the perspective of Rashi and the medrash, and you'll find that there are other things about the story that also don't appear to make sense. Number 1, Aleph. Ma hoya taima shel Yosef? It's such an important question, and it's a great question, especially when we get into the halachic detail of it. Ma hoya taima shel Yosef b'drishasem ha'mitzim she'imoylo b'frat hefech retzonim? Eizeh tenet zagia mizeh? Why did Yosef want them to have a bris? What's the value? They're not converting. They're going to be Egyptians. What is the value of Egyptians having a bris? Why does Yosef push for this? And not only that, but as we'll see in a moment, who says he was allowed to demand that they have a bris? So the base, number 2, much earlier on in the beginning of the Torah, when it says that Hashem warns us that he will take retribution against those who spill blood. Rashi explains this refers to a person who spills their own blood. It's not classically murder, it's personal bloodletting. Zoy meres is fascinating. That means to say that if you just look at the pshat level, we're not talking halacha lemaisa, practical application of Jewish law. But if you just look at the pshat of the pasuk at that point in time, a person is not allowed to cause themselves to bleed. Even if it's not going to leave them with any serious injury and not even going to kill them. And it's quite similar to the immediate preceding pasuk that says that you're not allowed to eat blood. And there it's talking about blood from a living creature. So the same thing, that the person's going to live. It's not going to harm me. But the implication at the beginning of the Torah, according to Pshat, is that you may not willingly cause yourself to bleed. Which, by the way, answers a very interesting question How come it is that Avraham Avinu, who fulfilled all of the Torah before it was given, did not have a bris until Hashem explicitly instructed him to do so? Even though he observed the whole Torah. Simple now. Because he had a direct instruction from Hashem not to spill blood, not to him personally, but to the whole of Bnei Noach, anybody who was alive at that time, had a direct instruction from Hashem not to spill your own blood. So it goes without saying that you cannot now voluntarily choose to do a mitzvah, even as a hiddur, as some kind of extra commitment to Hashem, if it goes against a direct instruction of something you may not do. But then, of course, when Hashem tells him that he has to have a bris, now he no longer has the problem. So now the instruction to have a bris will override the instruction not to let blood. But coming back to our story, how could Yosef instruct the Egyptians to have a bris, which means they would cause themselves to bleed, which would be a prohibition for them? How could Yosef instruct them to do something they're not allowed to do as Bnei Noach? Interestingly, in the note, the Rebbe says that's a reason in itself why the people of Shechem should have been suspicious of Shimon and Levi's intentions to tell them to have a bris. For this exact reason, how can you tell us to circumcise ourselves? Your family was instructed by Hashem to do so. We were instructed by Hashem not to let ourselves bleed. Now, this is a great question. What did Yosef intend to achieve by making them have a bris, and why is he even allowed to do so? V'habi'ur bozeh, the explanation of this point will help us understand everything else. Right at the beginning, when Paroi promotes Yosef and he says, you'll now be the viceroy of Egypt, and he says, you'll be in charge of my home, and by your mouth everybody will be sustained. Pirish Rashi, what does it mean, yishak, that they'll be sustained? So Rashi says, yitzan v'isparnes. He says they'll be fed by you, and all of their needs will be provided by you. That's how Rashi explains Yosef's position. That means that Yosef is the man. He's in charge. Paro is a figurehead, and he might have veto powers and some kind of deity status, whatever he had. But Yosef is the person running the show. And Yosef took that on as his role. We find that the Torah describes it in detail. He goes about and he creates these big reserves of grain for the years of famine that were coming. So he takes the role. Now, it's quite obvious what's going to happen next, right? If Yosef is the person who is empowered by Paroi and accepts the position and puts the position into practice, so he's the one who determines who gets which resources, well, then it's quite logical that when the people come to Paroi, he's going to say, why are you coming to me? When the people come running to Paroi asking for bread, we have to ask ourselves, why did they go to Paroi? They know the rules. They know who's got the power. In any society, everybody knows that even though the person you need to speak to may not be the person who is the top of the entire governmental structure, but if the person holds the keys to what you need, that's who you go to. Now, in this case, Paroi doesn't hold the keys. So that's what alerts us that something's unusual in the pasuk. Why are the people crying to Paroi for bread if he's not the supplier of bread? All of their needs were to be provided by Yosef. You have a problem, go to Yosef. So therefore, so therefore the pasuk has left out something which it felt it didn't need to tell us because it's obvious. Surely, if they were looking for food, surely they did go to Yosef. They're coming to Paroi to complain that Yosef's not doing his job. He's supposed to supply us the food, and he refuses to give us the food. He's making these untenable conditions. What's going on over here? Why is Yosef not doing what he was appointed to do? That's the issue. That's why they went to Paroi. The pasuk doesn't have to spell this out for us. Any thinking person should realize, hey, it doesn't make sense that they're going to Paroi for food. He doesn't have that role. He's given that role. He's delegated that role to Yosef. So therefore, al Yosef bikish mem dvar ma derech shematzinu shekonu bechesed v'chulei. So therefore, it has to be that Yosef wanted something from them for the food. Like later in the next parasha, you're going to see that he asked them to pay money and then to give their flocks. So by the same token, over here, he asks them for something that they don't want to give. Shem lo yiskimu la'asosei. They didn't want to do what Yosef suggested. So therefore, who do they go to? Who else can you go to? Your own king. Say, King, you've appointed this man. We need his help. He refuses to help us because he wants these draconian things from us. Okay, so now we have just one question, just one mystery. What was Yosef asking of them? So now it's clear to us, without Rashi having to spell it out, and for that matter, without the Torah having to spell it out, it is clear to us that they only went to Paroi as a last resort, implying that they had to have already been at Yosef. Now we've just got to work out what could Yosef possibly have said that made them panic. So mitochen ha'parashas v'apsukim shelmadnu kvar mikodim lifnei ha'teves asher yom lechem tasu muven shal Yosef alem sheimodu kidel kamon. So you go back and you read context and you see what's happened in the Torah up until this point in time, and you get to realize with just a little bit of logical deduction that there's only one thing Yosef could have demanded of them, which they were so offended by, namely to have a bris. How do we know this? How is it so obvious? Well, if we understand the laws and parameters of a bris, you'll immediately see how it all falls into place, and it's actually incredibly logical. When Hashem commanded Avram Avinu to give himself and his family members a bris, he also said this. He said that the extent of the mitzvah bris is for yourself, for your family, and those who you possess. It's quite logical why Hashem told him this, because effectively what Hashem was telling Avraham Avinu is anybody who is in your jurisdiction has to be included in your requirements, in your mitzvah. So anybody who is under your control, family member or slave, has to have a bris. That's the parameter of the bris. Al pizeh. Now you look at Yosef. Yosef is the person who has the entire Egyptian nation under his jurisdiction. Nobody's allowed to move, Paroi says. You can't lift your hand without permission from Yosef. They're effectively his slaves. Effectively, what's the logic of the slave? Why does the slave have to have a bris? Because he's under the jurisdiction of the owner. So the owner's mitzvah applies equally to him. What is the status of the entire Egyptian nation at this point in history? Completely under Yosef's jurisdiction. So therefore, they are unable to do anything without his permission. They're like his slaves, and they fall under his mitzvah responsibilities as well, which means they should have a bris. So according to a simple reading of the pasuk, you put all the pieces of the puzzle together. Yosef has a responsibility, like his great-grandfather Avraham Avinu had a responsibility to circumcise his slaves. Yosef feels now that he has a responsibility and an opportunity to circumcise an entire nation of people who are technically his slaves. Now we can actually see the wording of Rashi is so precise. It's actually quite an elaborate way to say what could have been simply Yosef told them. He was saying to them. Not that Yosef said, he was saying, which means it's something he consistently told them. It was a mission that Yosef was on for a long time. Get them to have a bris. This is a demand that Yosef made on the people consistently. It was his big campaign. Circumcise yourselves. And now he had extra power to do so because now there's a famine and people are more reliant on him, and he has a more compelling way to get them to actually do it. Serim Izay, al pi anal shemechuyev Yosef lishtadel sheimoilo muchrach loy meshek shechazak hara beretz Mitzrayim umuchrachim hayu lifnes el Yosef mechuyev haya Yosef loylim korba kesef ki im loyim lem ututnai sheimoilo. Now, if you put this all together, Yosef has a responsibility passed down through the generations to give a bris not just to his family members, but to those who are under his jurisdiction as his so-called slaves, which now extends to the entire Egyptian nation because he's been empowered by Paroi, and more so during the time of the famine, where they are destitute and completely reliant on him. And therefore, he has the greatest power and opportunity to make them take a bris. The last thing that he should do is charge them money for food when he could use it as leverage to get them to have a bris, as they are required to do by Hashem's instruction. Therefore, we get it logically just by applying a little bit of research and a little bit of rationale to the Torah up until this point. Rashi says, I don't have to tell you what his condition was. It's self-evident. So now the people are not happy with us, so they go running to Paroi and they say, Paroi, help us out over here. What's Yosef on about? Do we have to have a bris? Where does this come from? It's ridiculous. So they think, pull rank over here, Paroi. Yosef's only your 2IC. You can tell him still to override this ridiculous requirement. Paroi says, I'm not getting involved. Go to Yosef and do whatever he says. If Paroi refuses to intervene and he refuses to change Yosef's mind, move on, because there's got to be a good reason for it somewhere, somehow. There's got to be a good reason. So we now need to understand the reason. Why is Paroi unwilling? Paroi is not a fan of monotheism. Paroi doesn't have the instruction from Avram Avinu. Paroi could turn around and say, this is not our culture, and this is not our religion. Why are you imposing these things on our people? But he doesn't. He says, I'm fully supportive. Whatever Yosef says goes. It's not for religious reasons. So what was his motivation? Rashi. So therefore Rashi says he had a purely self-interested reason. A fear, actually. He's worried. Look what happened when Yosef made a decree against our grain. It all rotted in our storehouses. Basically, what Paro is saying is, if it was natural consequences that caused this famine, then I could interfere and tell Yosef what to do. But now, let's be honest about it. The fact that we're in this pickle is because of supernatural causes that are precipitated by Yosef. And that's not going to help for me to interfere. So what am I going to do? Tell him to give you food. So he'll give you food. And then what will happen? So he'll give you food, and then he'll decree that food also rots. So what would you have gained? If it's a normal situation and Yosef's just being difficult, I, as Paro, could tell him what to do. But if Yosef has that kind of power, it doesn't help, so I'll tell him to give you food. Gesundheit. And you'll take it home. By the time you get home, it'll be inedible. What do you think we're going to achieve over here? You have no choice. You have to listen to Yosef. He's got incredible power. But that explanation may not be sufficient to motivate for why Paro was so on board to support Yosef. Because let's think about it. Maybe they'll take the food home and they'll be able to eat that day's meal before the food rots with Yosef's decree. Maybe Yosef is a kind man and he won't decree. Now that you've come to him humbly and you've gotten the food from him, maybe he won't make the decree that it rots. And let's say worst comes to worst, he does make a decree that the food rots. You're no worse off than you were before you went to Yosef. So people could have said, we'll take the gamble. Okay, Paro, get involved, tell him what to do, and we'll take the gamble that maybe the food's not going to last. So therefore it has to be that Paro was not only worried about what's going to happen tonight, tomorrow, that the food is going to rot. He was worried about an immediate threat. And he was so worried that he says, go do kol, everything he tells you. What is that? Misa b'meshech hazman b'rav. So now, let's think about it. The threat that was hanging over their heads was, you don't eat, you die of starvation in a couple of days' time. So what could be worse than that? dying now. So if that's the toss-up, right? The toss-up is, maybe I force Yosef to give you food. You take it home and it all rots. And then you die of starvation. So what other thing could Yosef hold over us that's even worse? Dying immediately. So that's why Paroi says in Rashi's version, in Rashi's explanation, what does Paroi say? I'm not just worried about the fact that he might possibly decree against the food as he has already done. I'm worried that if I cross him, he's going to now decree that we die. And that's why he says, Aleinu. I'm worried we're going to die. Now, think about it. Yosef's a good person. Yosef has values. Yosef doesn't just willy-nilly take vengeance against people who perhaps didn't treat him with the right respect. So why would he punish the people if Paroi would be the one forcing his hand that he should distribute food to the people? That's why Paroi has no choice. That's what Rashi says. The word is, Paroi says, what if he makes a gzera against us? Because I'll be the one who pushed Yosef's hand, so I'll be the first one who's going to die. If he's going to be so-called upset at any of us, if he wants to show his supernatural power over any of us, I'll be the first victim, and then we'll all die. Now, this is alluded to, the fact that Paroi was worried that Yosef might decree that he and, by extension, the nation, could die, is also alluded to in the words Yoimar, future tense. We were worried that this is something that Yosef had already told them previously, so why is Rashi putting it in the future tense? Why is the Torah putting it in the future tense? Yoimar, what he's going to say. Well, actually, that's exactly what they're afraid of. They're afraid of what Yosef's going to say. Basically, what Paro is saying is, so far we know that Yosef wants us to have a bris. But I got news for you, whatever he tells us in the future, we're going to have to listen. Because the same power that he wields over us now is the same power he'll wield over us for the foreseeable future. So if tomorrow he comes up with some new thing that we have to do, some ritual that we have to follow, we're going to have to listen. Now you got to ask, what's going on in Paro's head? Why was he actually worried? What did he think was coming next? The bris is something that Yosef had been talking about for a very long time, so it was kind of predictable that Yosef would want them to have the bris. But what else is Paro concerned about? So Rashi wants us to understand that this future tense, what he's going to say, is actually part of the reason why we are so concerned to listen to Yosef. So he's not just saying, I'm worried that he might come up with a new idea and a new ritual that we have to follow. I'm worried that he might come up with a new decree against us. He came up already with a decree against our food. What if he comes up with a decree against us? Embedded in this Rashi are beautiful, in-depth insights that we can apply in our own lives. In many places in Hasidus, it explains that Yosef was on a totally different spiritual plane to his brothers, even though they were great tzaddikim. And he was what's called Merkava La'atzilus, which means a vehicle for absolute godliness in this world, the highest level of unmitigated godliness in this world. Because of that, the world meant nothing to him. It was no obstacle to his service of Hashem. It was no distraction from his service of Hashem. He could be completely invested in the world, and it would not in one iota shift him from absolute connection to Hashem. That's why he was capable of being in the most depraved part of the world, Egypt, and simultaneously absolutely connected to Hashem. Mashenkin Ashvotim. Yosef bechinas merkava debria hutzchol yes beis boidus mei ha'olam velachem bachol Yosef broya tzayim b'chtei shinon elemazel lo yatid Yosef avodas Hashem b'chulei. Whereas his brothers, the Shvatim, they were a vehicle for a lower dimension of godly energy called the world of Bria, where there is a little bit of a sense of the reality of creation. So even though they're great tzaddikim, they're totally dedicated to Hashem, but in order to preserve the pristine nature of their dedication, they removed themselves from society because they were afraid that society could contaminate their connection. So that's the big difference between the brothers and Yosef. And by the way, that explains a lot of the conflict between them. They just didn't get him. They didn't understand that his approach to life, this self-grooming and these dreams of grandeur, which to them would have indicated that you are off the rails of holiness. In Yosef's case, there was nothing that would derail him from holiness. Chassidus always talks about how he's immune. Yosef is completely immune to any of the dirt of society. Rashi here tells us not only is he immune, not only would the world never distract Yosef from his connection and his service of Hashem, but much more than that, look at the tremendous impact he had on the world around him. Not only did he not allow it in to affect him, on the contrary, he took control of it and transformed it. Look at what he did. The single most notable depraved behavior of Egyptians was promiscuity. What does Yosef do to them? Makes them have a bris, which naturally limits the propensity to promiscuity. He takes their lowest, most debased part and switches it and elevates and transforms it. And not only that, and the brilliant part of this is that you've got Paroi, who's the king of Egypt, not just as a figurehead. He represents the epicenter of what Egyptian society is all about. And now he is the one who endorses having the bris. It's a coup of note. That's Yosef. Yosef is not only unaffected by the world, but he radically revolutionizes the world the minute he touches it. Now, Yosef, of course, is an incredible tzaddik. He's called Tzaddik Elyon, the supreme kind of a tzaddik. And you'd think, what's it got to do with you and I? It's got a direct lesson for us. Yisrael nikra'u b'shem Yosef, k'may shekasav noya katzon Yosef in Tehillim. David HaMelech calls the entire Jewish people collectively Yosef, which means that Yosef's life is an example for us of what we can achieve. Therefore, we are all empowered as descendants of Yosef, that wherever we might be, no matter what kind of people we're mixing with and how distant they might be from holiness and godliness and Judaism and spirituality, we should not be afraid of that environment and that it might negatively affect us. On the contrary, but every one of us has the capacity and the responsibility to overcome our desires, temptations, distractions, and be completely dedicated to Torah mitzvahs, regardless of where we live, regardless of the nature of our society and surroundings. And not only that, so what are we capable of doing? Not just protecting ourselves from the world, but having a positive influence on those Jews around us who we may feel are so disaffected and disconnected. And not only that, but through proper conduct, we can become a light to the nations and have an impact on them that they fulfill the 7 Noach laws. And through that, we elevate, fix, and refine the entire world. And then, through that, we will see the fulfillment of the promise that we'll have the coming of Mashiach, where Hashem will convert the entire world to a singular focus of dedication to Hashem and to a singular focus of service of Hashem. We should, in Mitzvah Hashem, be zoiche to see that. Take care from Miyad immediately.